Morning, again, whose life are we working through? Paul. The life of Paul. And we have gone through Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and then now we're in the book of Romans. And Paul is writing this from Corinth, right here, which was the city of what? Sin. Yes, it was the kind of the modern day Las Vegas, or that's what it would be like compared to back then. And he's writing to Rome, which is kind of what the modern day New York City would be like. So he's planning, he says, man, I have big plans. I want to put my headquarters in Rome. I want to go to Rome. And he did, didn't he? But he went in handcuffs. Not quite the way he thought he was going. But we're in Romans chapter 4. We finished chapter 3 last week, and normally I do a little refresher, but as we start to work through this, the refresher takes more time than the sermon, so at this point we are in Romans chapter 4. And we're talking about how we're made right by faith, not by works. And Martin Luther, I've talked before about how we all have a love language, and God reaches us through our love language. If you're touch, He's going to touch you. If you're quality time, you're going to just kind of know suddenly that you have a faith in God. You might not know the date or the time because over a long period of time. Well, Martin Luther said when he read that we are made right with God by faith, not by works, he broke down in tears, and he had already been out preaching and proclaiming the gospel for years. But he said, I still had this works mentality that I had to work off my salvation. And suddenly, when this came to him, he was broken down in tears. I think every human being, they kind of live with this internal courtroom. And we constantly measure ourselves against standards, our own, our cultures, our parents, or even sometimes God's standards. And we spend our lives trying to build a resume that screams, God, I'm worthy. I'm good. I've earned my place. But in Romans chapter 4, the Apostle Paul, man, he shatters every human instinct. And you know what he does? He points us back to the grandfather of all time. So if we were talking about the forming of our country, and you said, well, what do you mean? I would say, George Washington. You'd go, oh yeah, George Washington. Well, he's speaking to some Jewish people. And they are trying to understand this grace. Because you could see him throwing questions at him. Well, so then we can do anything we want. So actually, if we just sin a whole lot, the grace gets bigger. So let's just go sin a whole lot. And Paul's like, no, you miss. You're covered by grace, by the blood of Jesus Christ. So he says, let's talk about the forefathers of our Christian faith. And in Romans chapter 4, Paul immediately takes them to Abraham. Now the Jews all go, oh yeah, just like you would go, yeah, George Washington. Yeah, I chopped down the cherry tree, and I know it's all these stories. And you heard, like supposedly George Washington never told a lie, right? You know? And he said, so he went to his son and he said, who pushed the outhouse in the river? And the son, George Washington, said, well, I've never told a lie to you, Dad. I did it. And George Washington's dad spanked him. And when he was done, he said, well, that's not really right. When you said, who chopped down the cherry tree, and I told you the truth, you didn't spank me. And George Washington's dad looked at him and said, yeah, but I wasn't sitting in the cherry tree when you chopped it down. But we all know who George Washington is. So Paul immediately goes to Abraham. Now they all go, oh yeah, Abraham. We know Abraham. So, and he answers this question, and he says, he starts out in chapter 4, verse 3. He says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Remember that. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Did he have to encompass the Holy Land first? No. Did he have to get circumcised first? Circumcision came later than this. So this is where Paul's going. He's like, okay, I got your attention. We're talking about Abraham. He's the father of all people, basically, that are called under the name of God. And he says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So in other words, his belief in God made him righteous, not the outward signs. So then he says, all right, now let's work through this. So he answers this question: how can a guilty person ever be made right with a holy God? So he starts out and he says, faith, not works, brings righteousness. Now Paul gives him an illustration of Abraham because we're humans. We need these illustrations to take a point and go, oh, okay, I get it. Especially my brain. Man, stuff floats right through me, but then somebody says, oh, well, compare it to, a big apple falling out of a tree, Oh, I get it. Okay, yeah. So Paul, he says, all right, I'm going to use Abraham as an illustration. And he starts out in Romans chapter 4, 1 through 8. Abraham, now this is Paul speaking, was, humanly speaking, the founder of our Jewish nation. What did he discover about being made right with God? So he says the founder of our Jewish nation. So when I say Abraham, there's 3 big faiths that have an Abrahamic beginning. Can you tell me what they are? Christianity? Huh? What's that? Oh, you're good. Yep. I didn't want to put you on the spot. Christianity. Then we have the Jewish faith is based off Abrahamic, but they just don't believe in Jesus Christ. Can anyone tell me the third one? Muslims, yes. They all come from the Abrahamic faith. So when he says, man, I'm going to make you the father of everybody, he was not kidding when God said this. So I'm reading on what Paul says. What did he discover about being made right with God? If his good deeds had made him acceptable to God, he would have had something to boast about. But that was not God's way, for the scripture tells us Abraham believed God and was counted him as righteousness because of his faith. So, we see this. So, let's talk about Abraham. There was an ancient plan of salvation. If any of you have ever watched The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Aslan says to the witch, there was deep magic she didn't know about. Well, that's the same thing. We've described how Satan did not know the plan that Jesus was going to die on the cross. He didn't know that. If he did, he would have tried to stop it. That's why Jesus spoke in parables. That's why he said, hey, go, don't tell anyone yet. It's not my time. Everything was hidden from the enemy. So this is the point. There's a story with Abraham that sets the covenant with us and God. But it was kept secret from Satan. So, Abraham starts out with his dad. They were a rich family. For some reason, it's about 400 years after the flood. The world has elapsed into idolatry and wickedness again. I feel like Forrest Gump when he's like, and I met the president again. And that's like every time you read about the Israelites, they've fallen into wickedness and idolatry. And God chooses a family through which the Redeemer will come. And here we have, they're living in Ur, which, it's funny, I said, well, I want to show them, which is like modern day southern Iraq. And I thought, I'm going through the internet looking for pictures of southern Iraq. And I couldn't really find any to show the desert. And then it hit me. I spent a lot of time there, and I didn't take many pictures, but I took some. So, here we go with some of my pictures. There we are, getting ready to go out on a convoy, but as you can see in the background, there's not much. Dirt. Okay? So, then, look at the background there. All desert and dirt. That's southern Iraq. Not much to look at. There's not a green thing. I remember getting off the plane and being shocked. Like, wow, the green is really green. And that is, you can see, the berm. That is so when we would build a camp, snipers couldn't shoot at us. So they built a berm with the bulldozers around the area where the camp was. When we were done, we had to put it back. That was the deal the government made with the Iraqi government, our government made with them, that anytime we leave, we would put it back just as it was. So we had to knock the berms down, but we were now open to sniper fire. So we had sandbags piled up around us inside the bulldozers. And we would, all three of us, just work and shove the berm down as fast as we could so we could get out of there. But you can see southern Iraq. This is where Abraham and his family were. This is what a sandstorm looks like coming through. It's real. You see it on TV. You might think, oh, that's fake, and I can remember putting blankets around myself, goggles, and doing everything. And as you're out in the middle of the desert and one of these comes, you ain't outrunning it. So then you just try to breathe through it. And it's 130, and you got everything wrapped around you. And I remember the dust coming through all the blankets, wrapping around me, and then it would get through the little tiny air holes of the goggles, and it would swirl around inside my goggles. So that stuff found a way to get to you. And there's a picture I kind of liked. Those are all over the place out there. But this is probably the very thing back then. Abraham had a lot of camels. And they say if a camel back then was equivalent to somebody owning a dump truck. So they said if he owned 500 camels, it would be like Abraham owned 500 dump trucks with his own business. In other words, he was doing very well. So now we see a little bit of what this is like. So it begins in southern Iraq, predominantly pagan city, about 250,000 people back then, with a central temple to the moon god Sin. Isn't that appropriately named? Here, Abraham's father was thought to have been a craftsman in the moon cult. At a crucial turning point in history, for reasons unknown, Abraham's father and his family, they were determined to travel to Canaan. And they uprooted themselves from everything that was familiar, took the road. Then they got to Haran, and they kind of stayed there. So they traveled from southern Iraq, all the way up through Babylon, and they got up here. Now right down here this is Jerusalem and the holy city, what's going to become Jerusalem and the holy city. So they made it up here to Haran. And then that's kind of where they settled. And that was another center of worship for the moon god. And it was between Syria and modern-day Turkey. So the allure of the pagan city, it detained them, and they settled down. Now Abraham, this was part of a very rich family. I've heard people say that they had slaves that just fanned them with giant fans, and he was living the life. And they said, why on earth would he leave this? Well, I'll tell you why, because God called him. And he was settled in the lap of luxury, but then in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, now the Lord said to Abram, his name wasn't Abraham yet, God changed it later, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. And it continues on to say, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So, he's about 75 years old. God appears to him and says it's time to leave. It's a divine calling to leave his homeland and a promise to make him a great nation. You're going to become a great nation. And this marked the beginning of the relationship with God. God said, I need a family. And he said, here's this guy. He's in a family that's worshiping the moon god. You're going to get called. You're going to get called to become the father of all nations. And what does Abraham do? Later in Hebrews, when Paul is talking about this, in the like the hall of the forefathers or those with great faith. In Hebrews 11:18, it says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place where he would receive as an inheritance, which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Have you ever been called by God and didn't quite know how it was going to end? That's kind of how God does this with us all the time. So his wife, nephew, and a few other people ventured out once more into the unknown. This was a step of faith that represents our invitation and initiation into Christianity, where we're required to leave all and follow Jesus. The first call of Abraham was, look at what God says. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, what's the first two words he says? Get out. Get out of here. Was it really? Get out. The first command. The rest, all the blessings, all the promises of the promised land, and the future, all rested on these two words. Why? Because if he didn't get out, God couldn't do the rest. The first commandment was get out. So getting out can be a holy act just as much as anything else that God uses. The Messiah called his disciples to get out, to come with him. But in order to do that, first they had to leave. They had to drop their nets. They had to get out of their boats. They had to leave their old way of life. If they didn't leave, they couldn't come. So Robbie, back to a teen challenge. Can you say, hey, you have this new start. Can you keep your foot in the old one? Can you keep one foot in the boat and one foot? No, it doesn't work, does it? You need to walk away from that old life. You need to leave it to come into something new. Woo. So, God calls us to come, move, follow, to pilgrim, to enter into a blessing. But we can't know any of these things unless we're willing to leave the old life. There are a lot of people who long for change in their life. I need change, something better, something new. But we're not willing to leave the lies of the world. We want to keep one foot there. No, this is my peace. And God says you need to leave that first for those blessings to happen. When God said to take my people out of Egypt, they had to leave, right? Now there's a big moment where they crossed the Jordan. And a friend of mine said the other day, we downplay that. We talk about the sea splitting and them leaving Egypt, but we don't talk about the fact that the whole entire Jordan River dried up for like 5 miles so they could all cross it. And I said, well, first they had to leave Egypt, and that was a very, very important part of what God was doing with them. So Abraham leaves his homeland, and by faith he follows God. And God gives him these promises that he would become a father of a great nation, that his name would be great, and all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. And did the promises come true? Yes, they did. But however, he starts to doubt, and there's some stories there where he says, well, God must have kind of forgot about this because my wife's getting old, so I know I'll bring in a concubine or a slave girl, and I'll have a child. Maybe that's what God meant. I'll take care of this for God because he's obviously forgot about this. And sometimes we do that. We're like, God, I got it. You're busy. I know you've forgotten. Said you were going to give me a child. I got it, God. But that didn't quite work out. So we see areas of Abraham that he struggled just like we would. We all have a little bit of crazy in us, right? We all have a little bit of doubt. And that's just, we see it in Abram's life, which again, he later becomes Abraham. So, then, now he has this child and he raises it. This miracle comes. You all know the story. Sarah suddenly becomes pregnant. God says, I didn't forget that promise. You just have to wait on me. Sometimes waiting on God is not the easiest thing when we want that answer. We're like, hey, but God had a reason for Abraham to spend that time waiting on God. God was in that waiting period. Boy, that's really hard sometimes. But you just have to trust God's going to do it. And I don't care how old you are, how long you've walked with God, that is not always the easiest thing to do. So he gets a son. They're blessed with a son named Isaac, and he raises Isaac. He loves him. Can you imagine how excited he is? Isaac is going to be the extension of him that becomes a great nation. But then in Genesis 22, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. That's how we should always be with God. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey and the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. I want to go back to something. Verse 2, Then he said, Now take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So he tells Abraham. Did you ever get a call on Friday night from your boss? And they're like, I really need to talk to you. Meet me in my office Monday morning. And you're like, you got to be kidding me, right? I drive to their house, knock on their door. Look, this ain't going to work. If you know me, we got to talk now. But this is what he does to Abraham. He sends him on his way and then says, You're going to sacrifice your son. 3 days they traveled, with his son riding on the donkey next to him, and his son asking questions. Where are we going, Dad? What are we doing? Boy, it's a pretty cool journey. Father, son, we're going on this little vacay. Mom's at home. We can kind of just talk about Dad and little boy stuff. And the whole time, Abraham's walking, thinking, I'm going to go to this mountain and sacrifice my son. Gives him all that time to think about it. So he rose in the morning, and then in verse 4 there. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, son. Then he said, Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide you for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood on the altar, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar and upon the wood, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Can you imagine Abraham with tears in his eyes, struggling, putting the wood on the altar and bringing his son up? And then his son peacefully just did everything the father said. Kind of wonder, what are you doing, Dad? How come you're tying my hands? How come you're putting the wood on my back? But this was a test for Abraham because it was the beginning of the covenant. If you make a blood covenant with a friend when you're little, what do, right? You cut your hand, they cut their hand, and you shake. It means you're willing to do what they did. Is it, if you're like, no, I don't like cuts or scratches, so I'll just pretend like I did. Does that count? No. So, here's what happened. In such a covenant that God made with Abraham, each party had to be willing to do what the other was willing to do. Now let's open up a little bit of a mystery here. Abraham was willing to offer up his son as a sacrifice. Therefore, God would be willing to offer up his son as a sacrifice. The father brings his son on a donkey. There's Abraham and the son on a donkey to the land of sacrifice. So then God would have to bring his son on a donkey to the land of sacrifice, Palm Sunday. Messiah is brought on a donkey to the place of the sacrifice. The father places the wood on the son's shoulders. And he says, Isaac says to his father, my father, he said, here I am, son, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will himself provide the lamb for the burnt offering. When we unwrap a little mystery here, those words are going to just give you goosebumps because there's a meaning that a lot of people miss. So, the father places the wood of the sacrifice on the son's shoulders. God places the wood of the sacrifice, the cross, on the Messiah's shoulders. The son carries the wood up the mountain to the place of sacrifice. Messiah carries the wood to the place of sacrifice. The father lays his son on the wood and binds him. The Messiah laid on the wood of the cross and was bound to it. And again, Isaac doesn't resist. He peacefully submits, just like Jesus Christ did. The father lifts up a knife of sacrifice, but it's stopped. The knife of judgment instead goes to God, because Abraham was willing to do what God needed to do, and the covenant was made. Now, getting excited. So, Messiah is killed in the place of Isaac on the wood of sacrifice. It says in Genesis 22:12, don't lay a hand on the boy. The angel said, do not hurt him in any way, for I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. So we tend to see this as an angel came down and stopped him. But what happened when John tried to fall down and worship an angel? The angel stood him up and said, no, don't do that. Don't worship me. Did God see that? Was he looking the other way? Look, man, you can't do that. You're going to get me in trouble. Angels will not accept worship because that's only reserved for God. Let's read these words, and you can go back right to the Hebrew, and it still says the same thing. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from who? Me, even your son. Now they call it an angel because it was a messenger of God. We call it a Christophany. We call it Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Jesus himself came down, caught the arm of Abraham, and said, I got this. You were willing to do what needed to be done. Now I take his place. That angel was Jesus Christ himself, because he would have said, you have not withheld from God even your son, but he said, you have not withheld from me. That was Jesus Christ himself stopping Abraham, and the covenant was made. When the little boy said to Abraham, hey, we got all this stuff, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham said with tears in his eyes, God's going to provide it. How true that actually was. God provided the sacrifice. God provided Jesus Christ to become that sacrifice. Then he said, take now your son. I want to show you one other thing. Your only son Isaac, this is the beginning, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall tell you. Did you know it's the first time the word love is mentioned in the Bible? The first time the word love is said in the Bible is when God describes Abraham's son. And he transferred that love to us. Tell me, how deep is the love of God for you now? Can you get a better picture of the love of God? Because he's saying the first love in the Bible is the love of the Father for the Son. The first love in existence was that of the Father for the Son. And yet the Father was willing to offer up his Son through love to save us. So what does that reveal? If God offered up the Son that he loves to save you, then he must love you with the same love with which he loved his Son. As it is written, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So you don't ever have to wonder how much God loves you. It's already there. It's already on the wood pile of sacrifice. As much as he loves his only begotten Son, the greatest love in all existence, that's how much he loves you, folks. Maybe you have a mountain. Maybe you have some things going on in your life. I'm telling you this because we're going to go through a couple of weeks where there's people coming through this door. There's people coming that are going to be listening to music, and we're going to have the opportunity to share the gospel. And I want you to know, when we say, well, the Old Testament was the covenant and it led to the New Testament, what does that mean? Well, right there, the covenant was blood for blood. You had to be willing to do what we were doing. Abraham said, I'll do it. Can you imagine him going, the promise you gave me, God, the promise of everything, me being the father of all nations, and you were going to make my offspring like the stars in the sky. You must have lied. Or maybe, but he didn't. He's like, I'm going to trust you, God, but this is tearing me apart. My only son. So maybe you have a mountain. Maybe you have something that God is saying, I need that. I want that. That's something I gave you, but you need to trust that I'm going to take it from you. But he didn't. By Abraham trusting God, even in that toughest moment of letting go of his child. He was rich. Did God touch his riches? Nope. He was married. Did God take his wife right then? No. There was all kinds of stuff in his life, but he chose the very thing that was a promise to Abraham to bless him. This is a promise to you. Now you're going to sacrifice it. And Abraham was willing to do it. The blood for blood made the covenant, but Jesus Christ himself stopped his hand with the knife and said, all right, I've got this now. I will become that sacrifice. Blood for blood, the beginning of the covenant was made. So when I always say the covenant starts in the Old Testament, the picture of Jesus, now you see it through the life of Abraham. This is, folks, 17 more pages. It's not going to happen. I'm going to prove so you know it. Genesis, Abraham believed God and was credited as righteousness. Faith is for everyone. We were going to read that. Okay, we go through this. Don't have enough time. God's promises come through faith. Faith believes when circumstances say otherwise. These are all things covered in Romans chapter 4. Abraham's faith points to our salvation. Lessons from Romans chapter 4. If you get a chance, go home and read it. And maybe now that you know the story of Abraham. So when he's speaking to the Jews, he says, you know Abraham, right? And they're like, yeah, the father of everything, the one who made the covenant. And Paul says, he was made righteous by his belief. Not his circumcision, not his willingness to offer his son, not, in other words, are you saved because you're baptized? No, that's just a sign. Abraham wasn't circumcised yet. Even Paul says, God says he was saved before he was circumcised, but circumcision was a sign of the covenant. So Paul takes them all the way back and says it was his belief and his willing to leave his old world and follow God. Hey guys, let's sing a song. We've had them here long enough. They're drifting off. I'm losing them. Their eyes are slowly closing. It's getting warmer by the minute. So, I want you to think about salvation is by faith alone. Oh, that's okay. I want you to think about these things this week. And just be thankful for them. And be ready when someone needs to hear the gospel. I want you to bring that gospel to them in the right way. I want you to minister and witness to them and bring the love of God. And now you understand, oh, we got the covenant, Jesus fulfilled it. Old Testament points to Jesus. Every single thing. I mean, there's so much with the story of Abraham. We could study his life for the next 5 years, folks. I went through it quick, but there's a lot more to it. And he messes up just like everyone else. The father of our faith messes up bad. So if you get a chance, go this week. Read Romans chapter 4. And you're going to see how Paul uses the life of Abraham. And then he actually goes on and uses the life of David too. In chapter 4. What a blessing. Let's